musicals, like it says up there. And this is To the Evolution, Cultural Dialogue in the Contemporary American Musical. So, elephant in the room, let's get it out of the way. Musical theater's dying. It's sad, I know. But I mean, don't you miss the golden age of musical theater? You know, even if you weren't alive for it, don't you miss the feeling of being able to walk down the streets of New York and see the marquees for The Music Man, right across the street from West Side Story, and next door to like My Fair Lady? You know, musicals used to be wholesome. They used to be popular. People used to care. So, coming back to reality for a minute, have you ever heard this conversation take place? Whether or not you've been on the receiving end of it, there's this incredibly pervasive rhetoric that musicals are either dead or dying. Now, what the people who say these things don't seem to acknowledge, or worse, don't seem to care about, are the new musicals on and off Broadway, by the very nature that they aren't South Pacific, or Hello Dolly, or even Les Miserables. They somehow matter less because they are new. Now, the golden age of musical theater saw musicals become an extraordinarily popular art form that helped establish New York City as the artistic hub of North America. You know, you could go and see a grand spectacle of a show and come out having laughed and cried and humming the songs. You know, it was the ultimate act of escapism. Those are the emotions people typically associate with the golden age. However, just because what scholars consider the golden age of musical theater ended over 50 years ago doesn't mean that musical theater is dead. The last 10 years in particular have seen a booming influx in new, boundary-stretching musicals from a number of different writers. Musical theater historian and scholar Scott Miller has been one of the voices at the forefront in heralding what he calls this new golden age, writing in a blog post, quote, "The whole point of human storytelling, and musical theater as a subset of that, is to understand ourselves and the world around us, to make order out of the chaos, to get at some truth about the human experience. Not the human experience 60 years ago, but today," end quote. Now, the American musical is currently evolving into a new renaissance as a new crop of storytellers, many from marginalized communities, are demanding that audiences change the way they think about difference and inclusiveness. In this new renaissance of musical theater, there are two musicals that perhaps demonstrate this new evolution of the medium more thoroughly than any other. The first being Janine Tesori and Lisa Krone's Fun Home, the second being Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. Both shows are uniquely American in their own way, like the art form itself, and have challenged the notion of what makes a good musical. Fun Home, based on a graphic novel memoir by Alison Bechdel, recounts Bechdel's coming to terms with the suicide of her closeted gay father. Now, Hamilton, meanwhile, is a bold, racially diverse hip-hop retelling of the life and times of founding father Alexander Hamilton. Both shows have excited audiences more than many shows have in the last couple years, musical or otherwise, and both shows have the critical clout to back it up. Fun Home was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama back in 2014, and just 3 days ago, Hamilton won. So, Bertolt Brecht famously remarked that art is not a mirror to hold up to society, but a hammer with which to shape it. And as a commercially viable piece of popular entertainment, what better hammer to shape American society than the born and bred American musical? And for those who are using this hammer and this new evolution of musical theater, what better choices than those who are constantly living on the outskirts of the hetero, male, cis, and white-centric society? So, this trend of socio-politically minded musicals is not new. From practically the earliest days of the book musical, shows like Showboat, The Cradle Will Rock, and Of the I Sing challenged audiences to question their society through the guise of the popular entertainment of the day, the musical. The 1960s, however, saw musicals reach a new level of social involvement. It's almost as if musical theater practitioners began using musical theater as a form of social justice through social commentary. So just on the surface of American society in the 60s, there was the civil rights movement, there was the mass public pushback against our involvement in Vietnam, and there was the loss of American innocence and identity in the assassination of President Kennedy. And the musicals of this era began looking at the troubled American society and became Brecht's hammer to shape it. The decades that follow also saw musicals that addressed the state of American society, but the times, the actual events of life, weren't nearly as volcanic as they were in the 60s. Now, what we're seeing now, however, is a similarly tumultuous time in American society, which is, in my belief, giving direct rise to this new sense of social responsibility in musical theater. So just in the last couple of years or so, there has been growing public outrage against police brutality and institutionalized racism, a rising number of acts of domestic terrorism in the forms of school shootings, the rising threat of global terrorism from extremist groups like ISIS, an increasingly controversial race for the next president of the United States, a devastating economic recession, and a rare victory in marriage equality becoming the law of the land. It's a new era of change in America, and the very fabric of the country's historically white, male, cis, and heterocentric society is constantly being challenged by those who live on the outskirts of it. So let's back up a bit. The so-called golden age of musical theater began roughly in 1943 with the success of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. And that show's enormous critical and commercial success led to the informal creation of what I like to call the well-made musical, a formula for what an ideal musical comedy should be. After a while, audiences began internalizing and expecting it. And the issue inherent in the formula, like any academically based ideal, is that it is naturally prejudiced, both in author and in audience. The musicals of the 40s and 50s and 60s were all written by white men. In their love stories, they inadvertently reinforced the normalcy of heterosexuality. In their predominantly white protagonists, they inadvertently reinforced the normalcy of whiteness. And in most situations, the stories with male protagonists, and even many of the ones with female protagonists, reinforced the normalcy of stories revolving around men. Now, as works of art, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the formula of the well-made musical, but they carried cultural implications that are larger and often not immediately visible. And even in the decades that followed, there was a limitation of those who were allowed to tell their stories on stage. Now let's look at Fun Home as an example of a musical that makes no attempt to adhere to the formula of the well-made musical. First off, it is a one-act musical that was originally presented in an intimate space in the round. Its protagonist is a queer woman, check, and the plot is non-linear, jumping from decade to decade with little warning. Now what makes the show truly groundbreaking, however, is the identity of those behind it. Alison Bechdel, the protagonist and the writer of the graphic novel the show is based on, is a lesbian. And by extension, that makes Fun Home the first Broadway musical ever with a lesbian protagonist. With its songwriting and bookwriting team of Janine Tesori and Lisa Crone, it also became the first ever Broadway musical to have an entirely female writing team. And immediately, it becomes apparent that the show's success is so significant because the creation process was so fundamentally different from every single show that came before it. Now, the relative lack of a queer female presence in musical theater is pretty surprising, considering the art form's historical relationship with gay men. Now, in his text, The American Musical and the Formation of the National Identity, Raymond Knapp argues that in analyzing musical theater, quote, "We must take due note of the relatively high proportion of often closeted gay men within the central communities of American musical theater," end quote. As the 20th century progressed, the well-documented relationship between musical theater and gay men began verging on cultural stereotype. So how was it then that it took the book musical, as we know it, nearly 70 years to get to a show with a lesbian protagonist? Knapp goes on to write, quote, "We should realize that the strong gay presence in musical theater has had much to do with an entrenched general reluctance to see the art form as contributing centrally to American culture, and thereby to our collective image of ourselves," end quote. Now, if our patriarchal society has been so reluctant to acknowledge the contributions of gay men, it seems that the fight for gay women to gain equal representation would be even more uphill. And by that token, one feels the sense that one is witnessing a landmark moment in American theater history when Alison Bechdel, as a 9-year-old, recognizes a butch lesbian in a diner and sees something in her. Well, there's the music. I don't know. Oh well, I'll read it. "In this whole luncheonette, why am I the only one who sees you're beautiful? No, I mean handsome." So in this scene, Lisa Crone makes perhaps the most culturally significant comment in all of Fun Home, as she puts butch femininity up on a pedestal in front of American society as a whole and calls it beautiful, or rather handsome. So for comparison, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton is also fundamentally different from virtually every other show that came before it, specifically in how it looks and sounds. The element of Hamilton that people immediately take note of is its color-conscious casting, which I want to talk about real quick. The term color-conscious casting versus color-blind casting. Color-blind casting is a fairly old practice in musical theater in which the race of a performer is totally ignored. Now, color-conscious casting, by comparison, embraces the racial divide between a performer and the role. A performer's race could be purposefully utilized for thematic effectiveness. And through this color-conscious casting process, Miranda and the cast of Hamilton have effectively brought critical race studies to the forefront of the contemporary musical theater discussion. Perhaps even more remarkably, though, they've forged a rare bridge between the worlds of musical theater and performance studies. Now, very few musicals have culturally dissected performativity and race in communities of color before, but Hamilton has succeeded where they have all faltered, and that is commercially. A significant portion of its commercial success is undoubtedly due to the buzz caused by it, but by the cast that accurately reflects the citizens of New York. But there's also the show's groundbreaking use of the various types of hip-hop. In the context of Hamilton, Miranda is utilizing what public theater artistic director Oscar Eustis describes as a Shakespearean act. Quote, taking the vernacular of the streets and elevating it to verse by telling the story of the founding of the country through the eyes of a bastard immigrant orphan told entirely by people of color. He is saying, this is our country, we get to lay claim to it. Now, for all the newness on display in both shows, audiences are clearly responding to both Fun Home and Hamilton. The American musical is evolving with us as a society. And what's more, it's providing us with Brecht's metaphorical hammer to fashion the world that we all deserve. But that these two shows exist is not nearly enough. One show by and about a queer woman in no way equals centuries of male-dominated drama, just as one or two shows that address the performativity of race in no way equal centuries of white-centric stories. And additionally, as groundbreaking and as successful as these two shows are in a lot of ways, the predominantly white Fun Home and the predominantly male Hamilton both implicitly perpetuate their own problematic ideologies. All that aside, however, the stage is set for a new age of musical theater, one that reflects and chisels the society around it. And we, as wary theater scholars, as wary theater practitioners, and as wary Americans, could perhaps find some peace of mind in knowing that the art form of the musical is headed into new and exciting territory. Thank you.